Hannibal had crossed the Alps with his large Carthaginian army. It had been a costly crossing, where he had lost many of his renowned and feared war elephants. His descent into the Italian peninsula meant two things. He now threatened Rome, the great capital of the Romans, but by doing so, he had released the unrelenting Roman army upon him, who, for the rest of the war, pursued him with multiple armies all the way to his homeland to make amends to the insult Hannibal had given the Romans. This is a description of the Second Punic War, one of the many wars where the two greatest powers in the Western Mediterranean faced off. As many of you know, the Romans end up winning the Punic Wars and eventually defeat the Carthaginians, and actually destroy Carthage itself, once and for all. But why did these wars happen? How did they start? And why did they change the path of Roman history? Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of the AIQ Podcast. My name is Alexander Goodman, and on this podcast we're talking about the Punic Wars, how Rome became an empire. We've got a special guest, Cristopher Kearney. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name's Chris. I'm a master's student here at the University of Wales, Trinity St David in Lampeter, doing ancient history. I've been on the course the same amount of time Alex has. My main area of research is I do Hellenistic history, mainly the Eastern Seleucid Empire, but I did my undergrad dissertation on Polybius and Livy and stuff like that, so I've done a lot of reading about the Punic Wars, which is why Alex has got me on to talk about it today. So I'm looking forward to it. Should be fun.
So to start with, let's have a brief overview of the Punic Wars. There are three of them, so let's delve into this. Would you like to take it away?
So obviously the first Punic War is the first one. It starts in 264 BC, ends in 241 BC. It's the longest of the three. And the war essentially happens because of Roman fear over Carthaginian control over Sicily. They think that if Carthage controlled all of Sicily, then they'd be more easily able to invade southern Italy, which the Romans weren't particularly... They weren't going to like that idea very much, I don't think.
No, not really.
So yeah. The war starts. It's a very similar pattern to how a lot of Roman wars start, which I think is something we're gonna get to later. But essentially, there's a city called Messana, which sits on one side of the Sicilian Straits. It's on the Sicilian side of the Sicilian Straits, opposite Rhegium, which is.
Can you just explain what the Sicilian Straits are for any viewers that don't know?
So the Sicilian Straits is just it's the bit of water in between the boot of southern Italy and the actual island of Sicily. And so Messana is the city that's on the Sicilian side of that bit of water, with Rhegium being the city on the other side in Italy. And this city of Messana had been quite unceremoniously, if you read Polybius, it'd been essentially conquered by, or taken over perhaps, is a better way of describing it, by a group of mercenaries from Campania in southern Italy called the Mamertines, who'd originally been hired by the king of Syracuse. And they'd basically been occupying this city for a number of years. And during their occupation, they'd been launching raids into Syracuse, who controlled the southeastern corner of Sicily, and Carthaginian controlled Sicily. They controlled pretty much the whole of the west of Sicily. And so they'd sort of been annoying the Carthaginians and Syracusans. So
they were effectively rogue at this point. They were just attacking whoever they wanted.
They were pretty independent, and they were just doing whatever they wanted. And the Carthaginians decided that they were fed up with this, so they sent an army to go besiege the city of Messana. And the Syracusans, not wanting the Carthaginians to have control over Messana, also raised an army and sent that army to Messana as well. And so there were these two armies sieging the city at the same time. At which point these mercenaries, the Mamertines, sent envoys to Rome to ask the Romans for help. And the Romans end up, in their usual fashion, if you read Polybius, they debate this stuff for ages. And there's all these long arguments, like you'd imagine in Parliament these days, right? And they eventually come to the conclusion that they're too scared of the idea that the Carthaginians would control all of Sicily, because they feared that if the Carthaginians took Messana, they'd be able to attack Syracuse, and then controlling the whole island of Sicily, they'd be able to invade Italy, right? So they decided that idea is too scary.
Yeah.
So they send an army led by Appius Claudius Caudex, and he goes down to Messana. He says to the Carthaginians and the Syracusans, "Go away." They say no. He fights them, defeats them, and that's pretty much the start of the war.
Yeah, so it's Rome getting involved because they're scared they're going to lose out effectively.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, that's how it sort of started. So what happened next was that Rome came from Italy, went into the town of Messana, and then marched down to Syracuse because they saw Syracuse as beneficial in two ways. So one, by having Syracuse on their side, they could ensure that any army they put and any troops they put in Sicily, they would be guaranteed to have food, water. They could be supplied and ready for combat. But also, Syracuse was really important because they were quite a wealthy society at that point, and they had a big navy. And Rome didn't really have much of a navy at this point. And one of the strongest points of the Carthaginians was their naval superiority. So they had to get the fleet of Syracuse to be able to compete.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most important parts of one of the things that makes the First Punic War stand out to me the most is that most Roman wars land-based, and obviously when you think of the Roman military force, you think about their army, the legionaries, the legions, auxiliaries, things like that, the land tactics and things like that. But the First Punic War is pretty much entirely naval, because land combat on Sicily. I'm not expecting people to know the geography of Sicily.
No.
But it's really it's full of hills and volcanic mountains, and as far as walking an army through there, it's pretty awful.
Yeah.
So land combat really doesn't feature very heavily in the First Punic War. It's pretty naval, which is at the start a major problem for the Romans because they don't.
Yeah,
really
they don't have a navy. They have to make
they don't really have
make
a
navy for this effectively. Yeah, so it's quite interesting that so we've talked before, like on the other podcast with Alexander the Great. It was all very land based, and all of history really has been very land based at this point, sort of, and now a war's erupting, which is mostly naval. It's very strange, very alien at this time. But it was something that had to be done because they could not face Carthage without a navy, and they had to get it somehow. And Syracuse was the easiest way.
Yeah, I think the capture of Syracuse as well. Probably it depends on who you believe. Polybius says that the Romans copied their ship designs off Carthaginian ships, but some historians argue that the Syracusans actually would have helped them in designing ships. So if you believe that theory, I suppose, then that the Syracusans were especially important. And another reason for the siege of Syracuse is as part of that treaty they bring Syracuse in as an ally. So they're not actually fighting the Syracusans. The Syracusans are instead on their side, which helps massively, I think.
Yeah. So what's also interesting is when the siege actually happens and Rome comes down to Syracuse and besieges them, there's no Carthaginian aid at all. So they quite convincingly win the siege and get Syracuse on their side, and it's an opportunity wasted for the Carthaginians, really.
Yeah, I think Polybius does actually know, I think, that the Syracusans are waiting for the Carthaginians to come and help them, which just never happens.
Yeah.
So it's one of a few things that Carthage seems to slip up on, really, quite early on in the war. Because Polybius mentions it, that the Carthaginians have overwhelming naval superiority, yet the Roman army that is originally sent to Messana crosses the Sicilian Straits completely unhindered.
Yes.
And Polybius, points it out as this is really weird. Why did the Carthaginians just let them cross in?
Yeah, especially when you think that during the First Punic War, Rome had to build 3 fleets because 2 of them got destroyed. So they evidently do have such a superiority there. Why did they let them cross? It's quite strange, quite interesting. Yeah,
no, the building 3 fleets thing is amazing to me because so the war lasts 23 years. I think I said earlier, it's the longest of the Punic Wars.
Yes.
But it's just that kind of the fact that the Carthaginians were so dominant navally at the start of the war, and then how that shifts following the war is quite stark.
Yeah. But what's evident is that when they did have these fights, inland and off-land, it was very give and take. It was very even in Sicily itself, with no clear winner. And until you have Rome, where actually Rome is able to invade the African peninsula.
So in 256 BC, the Romans launch a military expedition into Africa. under the command of Marcus Atilius Regius, and it's not a very successful expedition. He loses to a Spartan mercenary commander in 255 BC and is captured along with most of his soldiers. And the expedition is not very successful. What it does do is it diverts Carthaginian focus away from Sicily briefly, and it allows the Romans to build up there, so that I think it's in 250 BC is when they start actually making major territorial gains in Sicily.
Yeah, and at that point it becomes really really solidified, and it's probably because of this failed attempt that they win the war, because they managed to hold Sicily quite convincingly.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think that is a major aspect, because from 250 to about 247, they take almost all of the island of Sicily. Carthage is left with pretty much just the northwestern tip of the island. But it's at that point that they appoint a new commander over the Carthaginian forces in Sicily, Hamilcar Barca, who, if you don't know, is the father of Hannibal Barca, who
the very famous
becomes very important in the next Punic War.
Yeah.
But so he becomes commander of the Carthaginian forces in Sicily in 247, and for the remainder of the war, because of the tactics employed by Hamilcar, the Romans actually aren't able to advance further in Sicily. He manages to hold the Romans at a stalemate for pretty much 6 years.
So they still hold some importance in there, some influence in there, but it's nothing like they had at the beginning.
And the war finally ends with so there's a little archipelago of islands just to the west of Sicily called the Aegates Islands, and it's there that the war is finally won for the Romans, because obviously there's a battle there. It's a pretty massive naval battle. They're pretty much the entire Carthaginian fleet versus the entire Roman fleet, and the Romans managed to win that battle, which essentially destroys Carthaginian naval superiority, and forces the Carthaginians to sign the Treaty of Lutatius, which is named after the Roman consul who wrote up the treaty. And yeah, that is pretty much the end of the war, and the Treaty of Lutatius is pretty crippling.
Yeah, because I mean they were in a very bad spot. They were just holding on to a little bit of Sicily as much as they could with Hamil, and then they just lost their navy in a big fight. So really, they haven't got a leg to stand on. They've been forced into doing this treaty, and unfortunately, you can see it in Hamil's resentment to Rome, where he felt that he could have continued the war, and he's been holding on very strong. He felt he could actually make some gains and progress.
Yeah, which is important later with the Second Punic War, if you believe Polybius, at least.
One of the reasons it might have happened. But yeah, so they definitely get forced into it, and unfortunately Carthage just lost their power at the wrong time. And
then the Treaty of Lutatius doesn't go well for them either, because so the Carthaginians are forced to cede all of Sicily. They have to cede the Aegates Islands. They have to evacuate all of the islands that they controlled between Sicily and Africa. And there's a couple other islands north of Sicily, I think, as well, that they have to cede.
Yeah, and they also had to pay 3,200 talents of silver to the Romans over 10 years, which is a crippling sum of money at this time period.
It's a lot of money. And yeah, there's obviously the forbidden from attacking each other. And one important thing as well is that both sides were forbidden from recruiting mercenaries in each other's territory, which is a big deal for Carthage, because a lot of their land forces in Sicily were Gallic mercenaries from north of Rome's territory in Italy.
They were very mercenary orientated. For instance, like when they repelled the invasion in Africa, it was by a mercenary commander.
Yeah,
even their top generals.
It's a Spartan and Italian mercenaries, I think, that repel that invasion force. So it's a pretty big deal for the Carthaginians not being able to get mercenaries from Italy. And then 3 years later, after the war ends in 238 BC, there's a second treaty where the Carthaginians are also forced to cede Corsica and Sardinia to the Romans as well.
Yeah, which is a big loss.
Which essentially completely destroys Carthaginian naval superiority, because they lose control of pretty much all their islands in the Mediterranean near Rome.
Yeah, for anyone who doesn't know where they are, so Sardinia is, if you look at Rome, to the left of it, you have a big island and a small island together. They are Sardinia and Corsica.
Yeah, Sardinia being the larger of the two, Corsica being the smaller. And that's pretty much the First Punic War, and it's probably one of the most important wars as far as the Roman Empire is concerned.
Yeah, and because of how it ended with the sanctions put on Carthage and such an embarrassing defeat as such, and the kind of resentment still in like Hamilcar, it's very easy to see how this progresses into the Second Punic War, and and how it was almost inevitable that it was going to happen. So with the end of the First Punic War, then the things that are put in place is that the Carthaginians and the Romans can't attack each other, but also the Carthaginians are not allowed to cross the river Ebro in Spain, and they're not allowed to attack the city of Saguntum, which is in the same area of Spain. And this is to basically allow themselves to not interfere with each other, because Saguntum was allied to Rome, and it was the closest point to the Carthaginians, so it was the most natural point for them to attack. So that's what they had outlined. And so the Second Punic War comes around by Hannibal Barca attacking Saguntum, and therefore breaking this treaty. So Hannibal Barca, as we've mentioned, is the son of Hamilcar Barca, the general from the last war. And Hannibal attacks the city. So Rome then, in 219 BC, sends an envoy to Hannibal, basically saying, "What are you doing? Please stop this." Basically trying to alleviate the situation. And Hannibal just refuses it and turns him away. So in 218, Roman envoys then go to the Senate inside Carthage itself and declares war. Now, this is when something really interesting happens. Although Rome is the one that declares war by protecting Saguntum, it is Hannibal who takes his army, marches all the way around Spain, through France, and then down through the Alps with his massive army and 60 war elephants, and then arrives in the Italian peninsula, ready to attack Rome. And this is where the war really starts, and we see our first battle here.
Yeah. So the war kicks off properly in 218 BC is when it's officially declared. And the first major battle of the war is the Battle of Trebbia in 218 BC, where Hannibal defeats the first of many Roman armies that he defeats. And then the following year in 217, he wins the Battle of Lake Trasimene, which is one of his most famous victories. And then in 216, he defeats the largest Roman army ever assembled up to that point at the Battle of Cannae with his famous double envelopment maneuver, and completely annihilates the entire army, which is sort of a really big deal.
I mean, at this point, Rome had raised 3 armies. 2 of them had got defeated. They've got the biggest one they have ever created, and Hannibal just destroys it, but utterly destroys it.
Yeah, and the battle's not even close.
No, it's a very secure win for him.
And so then after Cannae, probably quite naturally, a lot of Rome's allies, especially in southern Italy and also Syracuse, which becomes important, those allies all defect to the Carthaginian side, which now gave Hannibal the ability to wage war, or the Carthaginians, I suppose, the ability to wage war in Sicily, and they had a foothold in southern Italy. So it's looking pretty dire for the Romans at the start of this war within the first 3 years.
I think it's fair to say, at this point, if you're looking in, Rome should not be able to win this war. You have Hannibal inside the Roman peninsula, butchering army after army after army. And I do want to give credit, though, to the Romans. They are very resilient. In the First Punic War, they had to rebuild their fleet 3 times. In this Punic War, they have to rebuild their army 3 times. They've got an insane manpower.
Yeah, more than 3 times.
They've got insane manpower that no other faction or empire has at this time, and it's quite staggering. But Hannibal is ravaging through their lands. All their allies are switching sides. It seemed hopeless.
So the turning point tactically in the war for the Romans comes when, because of the dire situation, the Romans appoint a guy called Quintus Fabius as Dictator of Rome, in order to sort of deal with the threat of Hannibal.
Yeah, I just want to say quickly that the Dictator is effectively just a single console. We're not saying that it's sort of like the Imperial period had come early or anything like that. It wasn't like
it's
like an Augustus.
It's a position in the Roman Republic that was appointed when the Republic was deeply threatened. But Fabius adopts a strategy that has become known by historians as the Fabian Strategy. And essentially what he did was he raised a fourth army, as ridiculous as that sounds. And essentially he uses his army to sort of delay Hannibal's advance to Rome as much as he can. So he avoids any open battles with Hannibal because it's just not worth the risk. And he sort of positions his army in ways whereby Hannibal can't actually march to Rome because of the positioning of the armies and the terrain and stuff like that. And so whilst he's delaying Hannibal for the better part of 10 years, really, the Romans are raising other armies to go fight the Carthaginian allies in other places because the Romans can defeat the other Carthaginian commanders. It's just Hannibal that they can't defeat. Whilst Fabius is delaying Hannibal, the Romans are retaking the cities in southern Italy that have defected to the Carthaginians.
They go and fight in Macedon.
Yeah, the
Macedonian.
The Macedonians who allied with the Carthaginians. The Romans go over there and knock them out of the war. And the fighting in Sicily, the Romans are able to win because they're fighting more average Carthaginian commanders compared to Hannibal,
who's obviously a great commander. But what's really important with that is the fact that they're trying to protect Rome for such a long time period. Really, it's just a race against the clock because they know that if Rome falls, it's the last nail in the coffin. They're done. They can't recover from losing Rome as well. That would be the end of the war. So they're sort of just holding them off as long as they can, dealing with all the external threats, to then come back and really go at the Carthaginians.
And once they've sort of reined in a lot of their own rebellious allies and they've sort of pushed back the threats to Sicily and southern Italy from the Carthaginian allies, they are able to go on the offensive. And so Publius Cornelius Scipio goes with a military expedition to Spain and begins attacking Carthaginian-controlled Iberia. And so he takes Carthago Nova, which was the Carthaginian capital in Spain. He takes that in 209 BC. And then in 206 BC, he defeats an army of the Carthaginians, and that essentially secures Roman control over Iberia.
But what this does is it unsettles the Carthaginians. So their main army and force is now locked up, being dealt with in the Italian peninsula by the new dictator, and they can't seem to get a break. They can't fight them. They keep running away and all this. And at the same time, they're just being ravished in Iberia, Spain. So they're in a bit of a predicament now. They've lost all their allies. They've all been defeated by Rome. Rome's now powerful again. What do they do?
And it especially gets worse for them because I think in somewhere around 204 BC, I think it is, Cornelius Scipio takes his army from Spain into Africa, which really unsettles the Carthaginians, and he starts he makes significant gains through Africa, and so eventually I think it's in 203 BC, 202 BC. The Carthaginian Senate actually has to recall Hannibal's army from Italy, and so the knife is finally removed from Rome's throat, and
instead placed on the Carthaginians because now the Roman army is near Carthage. They've just gone from potentially taking the city of Rome, and now the city of Carthage is under threat. And Carthage hasn't been able to do anything to stop it.
And then this all culminates in towards I think it's just right at the end of 202 BC, the Battle of Zama happens, which is the big final showdown, if you like. It's the army of Scipio versus Hannibal's army, and Scipio does essentially the unthinkable. He defeats Hannibal, and that essentially ends the war. Peace is signed. It's the Carthaginian peace is what it's called, I believe. That's signed in 201 BC. it's pretty bad for the Carthaginians. It's a lot worse than the end of the First Punic War, I think.
Yes, a lot worse.
And Scipio gets his he has honorary title. He gets called Scipio Africanus.
Yeah. But what's important is when you said the sanctions after this war is a lot worse. We'll go into that a little bit. So in the First Punic War, as we said, they lost a little bit of land, they lost some islands, and there was regulations like you can't attack us, you can't attack our allies, you can't cross this river. Well, now Rome had been like, well, we tried to warn you once, you've done it again, so now we're going to really put sanction on you. So they've lost all their land in Iberia. Also in areas of Africa. They're out of Sicily now.
Yeah, the Carthaginians lose all of Numidia.
Yeah, they've just basically got the area around Carthage itself. It's a very small place. They're now not allowed to raise any armies whatsoever.
Yeah, which is probably the most one of the more important parts. Their navy is also limited to 10 ships. It's never allowed to be larger than 10 ships, and those ships are only allowed to be used to regulate against pirates.
Yeah.
They're not allowed to be used for invasions or anything like that.
Basically, what they've done is they've taken a superpower of the Mediterranean world and turned them into essentially a trading city, and they have no military might at all.
They pretty much lose their independence. I think it's pretty safe to say that they're just a Roman client state after the Second Punic War.
I think you could probably argue this. It is not completely because of their politics are very liberal, and they're not actually owned by Rome, but essentially what they were is a former self. They are no longer the Carthaginian Empire. They're a small, minor faction inside the Mediterranean. Yeah. So, as we've just mentioned, Rome had put a lot of sanctions on the Carthaginians, and one of them was that they couldn't raise an army. And unfortunately for the Carthaginians, this is sort of why the next war happens, the final war, because so Carthage is put in a very bad spot. So in 151 BC, the Numidians, who are a local faction nearby.
It's the part of Africa to the west of Carthage.
Yeah.
Probably the easiest way to say it.
Yeah, well, they start launching raids on the Carthaginian territory, and the Carthaginians felt they had to do something, so they raised an army to defeat that. So although they haven't done anything to Rome, they haven't raised anything to attack Rome, they've just defending themselves, this broke the treaty that Rome had put on them. And it meant Rome had then threatened them with war and basically said, you disband your army or we're going to come over and kill you again. And this scared a few of the Carthaginian towns, especially Utica, who flipped sides and joined the Romans out of fear. And the Romans seized this opportunity and then sent 80,000 men to disembark in Utica. And by doing this, basically, the war had started, and Carthage was going to defend themselves, and the Romans were then going to attack them because they wouldn't get rid of their army. So the Romans go up to Carthage. They actually go to the city. They besiege it, and it's a long siege. It takes about 3 years, and there are minor skirmishes and battles throughout these. None really noteworthy.
Yeah, the Romans almost lose a couple, but Scipio Aemilianus, who comes out pretty well in Polybius. Polybius was his personal tutor. He tends to solve most of Rome's problems, which...
Yeah, I just want to say also, this Scipio Aemilianus, although he's got the same name as Scipio, is not like a son of Scipio Africanus we talked about earlier.
They're in the same family. They're the same family, and also Scipio Aemilianus also gets the name Africanus, which is sort of confusing.
Yeah, that is quite confusing.
But,
yeah, especially when it's all the same topic as well.
It's about 50 years later, so they aren't the same person. But,
yeah, but eventually Scipio Aemilianus wins the siege against Carthage, and a large proportion of the city's population are either killed or enslaved. And then Scipio Aemilianus then, in a 17-day period, starts systematically to burn the city of Carthage. And we know this from Polybius, who says that he was there and witnessed it. That's debatable.
I think it's reasonable to assume he would have been there.
It could have been, but
I'm a bit biased, though, I think.
But there's a lot of authors in history who claim they do stuff, like Herodotus, and they probably didn't in the end.
Yeah.
But Polybius does have a connection to Scipio Aemilianus. He was sort of his tutor, So you have to take that into account. Maybe it's a bit biased. Is all of it true? We'll go with yes. We'll go with yes for now. But yeah, we have to take that into consideration. And so they systematically burn the city, and they basically raze it completely off the ground. It's there is no remnants of it left until Caesar comes in and rebuilds it.
Yeah, and there's the old thing that they salt the ground, which probably isn't true.
No, it's probably not true. You can't dismiss it completely, but it doesn't really make sense. Yeah, and a lot of Monday scholars dispute it as well. Yeah. It's not just us with some tinfoil hats on, just doing conspiracies.
No, but that basically. Yeah, it goes pretty badly for Carthage. It's basically the end of the Punic Wars after that.
Yeah, and this is also the end of Carthage. They get absorbed into the Roman Empire. They're not like a client state. They don't rule as Carthage and just have an overlord.
Their territory is fully annexed by the Romans.
So we briefly talked about what happens in the wars and what went down, but something that's quite interesting is why did they happen? Why did these two major factions clash against each other? And what's interesting, it's debated modern day and ancient day. We're going to talk about that a bit later, but so I would like to know, Chris, for the first Punic War, why do you think they did start?
So as we mentioned earlier, it's the Mamertines send the envoy to Rome to ask Rome to come help them defend themselves, right? And so that's the start of the war, if you will. But Polybius rants and raves about this a lot, but he would say that that's the beginnings of the war. Is how he describes it, whereas the cause of the war is something separate, and he talks about that in the context of the Second Punic War, but it's something that you look at in the First Punic War as well. And I think I would say the reason that the First Punic War happens is because of something that it's something that historians call defensive imperialism, and it's sort of the major Roman foreign policy in the kind of middle Republican period from around the First Punic War to really the end of the Third Punic War.
So what is exactly defensive imperialism?
So the best way to describe it, I think, is if you think about imperialism generally in the kind of normal sense of the word, right? So you think why did Alexander invade the Persian Empire, right?
Yeah.
It was because he wanted the land, he wanted the glory. If you think about why the British Empire and a lot of the colonial empires in the kind of early modern period invaded a lot of like Africa, the Americas, India, places like that. It was because they wanted the resources, right? They're aggressing for a specific purpose.
What's the purpose of it?
Yeah, so they're trying to gain something out of it. Whereas Rome, in pretty much all of their wars in the Republican period and most of the wars in general in Roman history, if even though they might be for that, and you can often argue that they are for those reasons, the Romans always portray themselves as the ones being attacked.
Yeah.
And they're doing things defensively, right? So the First Punic War isn't because the Romans want to own Sicily. It's that they don't want the Carthaginians to own Sicily because they perceive that as a threat. So they are defending themselves by attacking the Carthaginians.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's what we would call defensive imperialism. And that's pretty much why I would say that the Romans go to war with the Carthaginians in the First Punic War, because I think that the Carthaginians aren't openly attacking the Romans at the time. It is pretty much the Romans who start the fighting.
Yeah,
but it's portrayed as a defensive act.
Yeah, Rome does this very well. They spin something where they are clearly the aggressors to be the defenders.
Yeah, it happens in most Roman wars in the Republican period. I mean, if you think of the Roman invasion of Cisalpine Gaul, which is like the top of it, what you'd now think of Italy, but it's not what the Romans called Italy. It's kind of like where Genoa and Milan and Venice
the very
northern
aspect of it,
Italy. Their invasion of that is sort of portrayed as the Gauls invade into Italy a lot, and there's a lot of like Gallic raids into Italy, and so the Romans, to defend the borders of the Italian province, expand their borders. So and then Yeah, there's the most wars are similar. The Macedonian wars, so the Romans ally themselves with various leagues of Greek cities, right? And the Macedonians are always saying, no, those Greek cities should be allied with us. We should control them. At which point the Romans are like, oh, you're infringing on the independence of our allies, right? And so the Romans then go to war with them.
Yeah.
It's that kind of idea, and that the first big major example of that in Roman history, I think, is the First Punic War.
Yeah. Yes, it probably is the first thing of this. But what's interesting is this idea of this defensive imperialism that we believe is probably the reason for the first one, could also be the reason for the second one. So the second one starts, as I mentioned earlier, with the town of Saguntum getting besieged. Well, there's two reasons as to why that happened. So you've got the Roman point of view and the Carthaginian point of view.
Yeah, there's two sides to it.
Yeah, I'll talk about the Carthaginian side because I think it's quite interesting because it's from a Roman side as well. So it's Roman historians have basically wrote down and said that the Hamilbarca, basically at the end of the war, the First Punic War, was so upset and so angry at what happened with losing the territories. I mean, losing the war as a whole.
Because as far as he was concerned, by the time that war ended, he still hadn't lost and he was still fighting.
No, he was holding Sicily, and he was, in fact, he felt he could invade more and reclaim more. So, no, he definitely was not ready for the war to end. And so I think he probably felt quite betrayed that the Carthaginian Senate had agreed to a peace and lost, Corsica, Sardinia, quite important things, and their huge taxes on them, where they had to pay 3,200 talents over a 10-year period. These are all crippling things which he felt very angry by. And so what Livy has wrote down and what Polybius has also written is that this anger transcended from him into his son Hannibal.
Yeah, it comes through in Polybius, because Polybius gives a nice, very Polybius-style anecdote, so after the Second Punic War, Hannibal flees to the Seleucid Empire in the court of Antiochus III, and Polybius gives this nice anecdote that is probably made up. Polybius wouldn't have been there. He wasn't even born yet, I don't think. So, but essentially Hannibal, when he arrives, Antiochus III doesn't trust him, as you would expect, I suppose.
Yeah, just a random general's
opinion. Hannibal explains to him the reason that everything has happened, and part of that is him describing his own anger and resentment and hatred towards Rome that he was instilled in him by his father.
Yeah.
And that was the reason that he attacked Rome.
Yeah, and that's why he marched and done such an amazing feat of going through the Alps. He wanted to risk all this because this anger had to be. Rome had to have vengeance on Rome. They had to bring the fight to them because he just detested them for the losses that the Carthaginians had taken. So, but then there's another reason, and that's the defensive imperialism, isn't there?
Yeah. So our two main sources for the Second Punic War are firstly Polybius and then secondly Livy. And Livy's a bit less systematic and critical with his history. It's just the style in which he writes. And he says that the cause of the war is Hannibal attacking Saguntum, right? And the Roman response to that is to defensively declare war on the Carthaginians, right?
Yeah.
But Polybius describes that as the beginnings of the war, which is where the kind of conflict comes up in our sources. And the reason that Polybius does this is that there were Roman historians before Polybius, who was a Greek. Those Roman historians had also described the cause of the Second Punic War as being the attacking of Saguntum by Hannibal. The main one being Fabius Pictor, I think, who Polybius often rants about how he doesn't like Fabius Pictor.
Yeah.
But so Polybius says that that's the beginnings of the war in the same way, and the anecdote Polybius uses is that if Hannibal attacking Saguntum was the cause of the war, then Alexander the Great crossing into Turkey was the cause of his war with the Persian Empire, which he poses as some kind of hilarious fallacy. And so Polybius outlines the cause of the war as essentially being that Hannibal hated the Romans because his father hated the Romans, which is fair, pretty probably true.
Yeah.
But there is the Roman side to it that Livy picks up on, and he doesn't do it in a great amount of detail. But Polybius sort of ignores almost, which is the idea that there is defensive imperialism at hand here again. Because Rome could have not gone to war when Hannibal attacked Saguntum, but they do, and it's defensive again, but they use it as a means by which to expand their influence.
Because what we've got to remember is Carthage didn't actually start the war. Rome sent envoys saying we're now at war.
Yeah.
It wasn't Carthage saying we're going to attack and we're starting a war. It was all the Romans. And, you can argue, why did the Romans just do it for Saguntum? So Hannibal was expanding all through Iberia, which is Spain. Why was it just Saguntum that was the problem?
Well, I think as part of the treaties after the First Punic War, right, the Romans kind of say, sure, Carthage, you can have Spain. That's kind of why I think part of the important part of Saguntum and the fact that neither side was to attack it or cross the Ebro is that it sort of limited Carthaginian expansion into just Spain.
Yes,
and then after that they couldn't really go anywhere without attacking Rome or like the Egyptians, which probably wouldn't have gone well for them.
No.
So kind of it essentially boxed Carthage in whilst Rome was free to expand elsewhere.
Yeah, it did do that.
But so it's pretty much inevitable that the Carthaginians would have attacked Saguntum eventually, or attacked Rome again. And the Romans probably knew that. And you get, in Polybius' account, there are Roman senators that are, at the moment that they receive news that Hannibal's sieging Saguntum, they're like, all right, get him, let's go to war.
There is a big shift, isn't there?
There's a faction in the Roman Senate that is like that.
Some are very pro going to war. I mean, Hannibal hadn't even attacked the city yet. There were just rumours of it, and so some senators were, let's go fight them, let's do it now. Others were more timid.
Which really brings into question the sort of defensive imperialism, because on one hand, the war is... It's defensive for Rome. I mean, realistically, Saguntum, as a neutral party in the treaty, has been attacked by the Carthaginians. The Carthaginians broke the treaty, and so they're aggressing against Rome. Right?
Yes.
So it is a defensive war, but there is that kind of idea that Rome also wanted to go to war with the Carthaginians, or at least part of Rome.
So something I find quite interesting, and actually makes me feel like this defensive imperialism is for only Rome's benefit, is the fact that when Hannibal besieges Saguntum, Rome doesn't actually help them. They don't send a relief force. They don't, come and help the city out. It's right, well, that war started, let's not go over and do anything with that. Let's just focus on Carthage as the enemy. So I think, yes, Saguntum is the cause, the city being attacked is the cause for it, but I don't think the idea behind Rome's defensive imperialism is to help these places or protect these places or be a friend to these,
which is why
they help.
Which is why we tack imperialism onto the end of it, I think, because it's defensive in nature, but the end goal is still the expansion of territory. I think it's not. I mean, the war is defensive, but there's like kind of an ulterior motive where they're looking to expand as a result of
it's defensive to get bigger.
Yeah.
So it's that mindset. If I'm the most powerful, no one can threaten me. But the only way you get powerful is by defeating people, and they do it in a way where they never seem as the aggressor. It's very, very clever. Very clever.
Yeah.
There's not many other kingdoms out there that do this sort of behaviour.
Yeah, especially not on with the same consistency as the Romans. I don't think. Pretty much. I mean, all their wars are, we're being threatened, so we have to go and attack these people.
Yeah. So with these two aspects that we're talking about then, the defensive imperialism on one side and this sort of Carthaginian hatred for Rome, which one would you say you're more inclined to believe?
It's a difficult question because, it's a topic that's been debated as far as we're aware since Polybius' writing, which is in around the 140s. It's probably after the end of the Third Punic War that he's writing.
Yeah.
So the 140s BC, and that's the earliest recording that we have of somebody arguing about what the cause of the Second Punic War is.
Yeah, it's happened ever since the actual event happened, really.
Polybius is arguing with previous Roman historians like Fabius Pictor. And so it's difficult to say. I think I think the war would have happened eventually without Hannibal, because I think the fact that the Carthaginians were locked into Spain by this treaty at the Ebro and Saguntum, that would have eventually, like, the Carthaginians would have eventually broken the treaty without Hannibal. So I think
it was inevitable.
That kind of sort of defensive setup where Rome has set it up in a way that they'll get to go to war again with the Carthaginians, but they'll get to swing it as they're the defender, right? It is sort of inevitable.
Yeah.
But I think it happens when it does because of Hannibal.
Yeah.
I think that's probably my easiest way to get around that question without answering it properly.
Yeah. See, I would argue that actually the whole reason why this happened is just because of Rome, because every single feature leads to Rome. So the hatred for Rome is there because of the absurd sanctions they put on them. A bit like Weimar Germany, why World War II started.
Yeah.
There was a lot of resentment, for the rest of Europe because of like taking the Rhineland and such. But with this, they've been crippled economically. A lot of land has been taken. Their armies are not as significant anymore because of the mercenary problem. So, that discontent is there because of Rome, and then Rome's also put this treaty in. If you cross this river and you attack this town, which is a natural expansion place for them, war was always inevitable.
Yeah.
So I personally would say this sort of defensive imperialism idea is probably the main feature for it starting. For me, all roads lead to that.
All roads lead to Rome.
Yeah. Well, not for Hannibal.
Yeah.
So we've talked about what's happened in the war, why the war started. Now let's talk about what happened because of the war, the end product. So we all know that Rome won this war. Rome had taken all of the Carthaginian land, incorporated it into themselves, and is now a major power in the Mediterranean. Not just the Western Mediterranean anymore, but the Mediterranean. And we all also know that Rome becomes a very, very large empire, and in a very short space of time takes a huge amount of land through their war machine that a lot of people like to put onto it. So my question really to you is, how much do you think that this Punic War series has on it? Are they now the superpower we all know and love?
Yeah, so I mean, the first, to answer the second part of that question, I suppose, is, so, especially in the Western Mediterranean, after the Third Punic War, there just, isn't anyone else, really.
No, there isn't.
And by the end of the Third Punic War as well, they've also defeated the Seleucid Empire in a war as well. So by the end of the Third Punic War, they are pretty much undeniably the largest, most powerful political entity in the Mediterranean.
Yes.
But I think one thing that's interesting about the Punic Wars and why they're important with regards to that is it comes from Polybius again, and I harp on about Polybius a lot. It's a problem I have. Alex gets annoyed at me a lot. But what Polybius' book, essentially, he starts it out, book 1, chapter 1 of Polybius. He says the reason that he is writing is to determine how and under what constitution did Rome, in a period of less than 50 years, come to conquer the entire Greek world, right? And he focuses on the Greek world because Polybius is Greek, right? And so he just is focusing on it. But Polybius starts that exposition of how and why in a period of less than 50 years did they come to conquer the Greek world. He starts that with the First Punic War and then the Second Punic War. And it's that kind of... It's the Punic Wars that essentially start Rome on its conquest of the Mediterranean.
Well, yeah, I mean, look at Rome before the Punic Wars, and they own the Italian peninsula, so they've beaten the Etruscans, right, which were another group inside modern-day Italy. But apart from that, they have nothing really else. They've got a little bit of influence in other places, but at no point are they a major player. I would say they're a strong faction, and that is seen by their ability to just rebuild fleets, rebuild armies. They are definitely a power you don't want to mess with, but they are not at the likes of Carthage or Egypt or the Seleucid Empire at this point.
Yeah, no, especially not before the First Punic War. I think after the First Punic War, you're starting to think about them on that kind of level of.
Yeah.
I mean, would at the time of the Second Punic War, the Romans would they have been able to defeat the Seleucids? And obviously, it's a difficult question because the Seleucid political situation in that kind of period would have affected it greatly.
Yeah.
But it's that kind of question. But definitely, by the end of the Second Punic War, Rome is on that level of the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic empires in the eastern Mediterranean.
Yes.
And it's that kickstarts their conquest of the Greek world, because almost immediately following the Second Punic War in the 190s BC, right, is when the Macedonian Wars start happening.
Yeah.
And one major reason for those Macedonian Wars is that the Romans are, again, they swing it as a defensive war, but you could argue that they're just looking for an excuse to attack the Macedonians because they allied with the Carthaginians. And so the Romans end up allying with some Greek cities, and then the Macedonians say, no, those Greek cities are ours. And then the Romans are, no, you're infringing upon the independence of our allies. And so they go toward the Macedonians. And that the Macedonian kingdom is eventually crushed. I think it's at the Battle of Punic, which is towards the end of the 190s BC. And then, Rome essentially after that has conquered the whole Greek peninsula. And then that kind of period of less than 50 years, as Polybius describes it, comes to a head in 146 BC again. Because in 146 BC, the Romans raise Carthage, but they also raise Corinth, which ends any sort of hopes of Greek autonomy in the way that they would have had in old classical Greece.
Yeah, or even Hellenistic Greece.
Yeah, right. So it's that kind of thing, which then their conquest of the Macedonians and their defeat of the Macedonians is what eventually leads to war with the Seleucids as well, and they beat the Seleucids and impose a really heavily crippling treaty on the Seleucids in the same way they did to the Carthaginians, which effectively ends any hope of the Seleucids defeating the Romans.
I think what it is clear to see is actually by the end of this, Rome has developed two features that is notorious for their superpower sort of ideas that go along with when you talk about Rome, and that's their military might and their political ability. So what I mean by that is the fact that they are able to now go and defeat the Greeks, defeat the Macedonians, defeat the Seleucids, and just keep steamrolling places on and on and on. This all does come from this kind of Punic War and that expansion and that ability to gain more land, get more people, but also politically, how they can impose and put their own wants onto people. So this defensive imperialism, they can make a war happening. They can make a war happen by the other person attacking them.
Yeah.
But it's something they want and the other people don't.
Yeah.
They start to develop these features, which for me does really highlight this idea that they are now the biggest player.
Yeah. I mean, and it's obvious, right? Because they end up just slowly, not even slowly really, they just kind of conquer the whole Mediterranean world, and it takes them a while to finish off Egypt, but that's because Egypt is handy with the grain supplies. But I think it's pretty unquestionable following the Punic Wars that Rome is the major player in the Mediterranean, and it because before they've even finished conquering the Mediterranean, with Egypt sort of sitting around being sort of semi-independent, if you want, they have moved on from the Mediterranean almost, and before they incorporate Egypt, they're having numerous wars with the Parthian Empire out in Iran and stuff like that. So they've sort of moved on from the Mediterranean pretty quickly.
Yes, their expansion is incredible. But also their you're talking about the military expansion, but also I'm just bringing it back to this sort of political expansion, where they're not just their ability to swing things in their manner, but how they can have influence over situations they shouldn't. So I'm going to use an example here. So Antiochus IV besieges the city of Alexandria. So Antiochus IV is a king of the Seleucid Empire, and Alexandria is a city in the Egyptian empire or kingdom. And Antiochus IV comes to the city of Alexandria, besieges it, and is about to take it, but a Roman general comes over, literally draws a circle in the sand around his feet, and says, if you have to come up here, make a decision. You either take Alexandria and you're at war with Rome, or you walk back and you're still friends. And that's incredible, because they're not even involved in this conflict, but Rome still has the final decision on what happens with these two kingdoms, and they're not even client states or satrapies of Rome. You know, it's an incredible reach they have over people.
Yeah, and another aspect to it, again, which is sort of coming in with Polybius again, the idea of under what constitution, just the means by which Rome is able to incorporate new territory and new client states into their administrative structure through the systems of provinces and governors and proconsuls and proquaestors and things like that, and how administratively they're able to organize things so efficiently and quickly that allows the kind of fast turnaround after wars, which is why you get war after war after war. Yeah. Which it is something that's in place without the Punic Wars, which is something that's worth noting. But it's part of the reason that makes the Punic Wars so, or not easy, but it's part of the reason that they win the Second Punic War especially, is because of that flexibility of their political system.
Yeah. So what I think the Punic Wars have done for Rome is essentially made them expand extremely quickly under a very short amount of time, which has then allowed them to have this episode of 50 years, say, to then have massive expansion. It's propelled them so much to get them on a base where they can then do this. If they did not fight Carthage and they started, taking bits of Gaul and bits of Illyria, stuff like that, it would be a much slower expansion, I think. And I think the Punic Wars is fundamental in what Roman history. Without the Punic Wars, I don't think Rome could become what they did.
Yeah, it kickstarts the whole Roman Empire, basically. Because, the end of the First Punic War establishes their naval superiority, frees them up to invade various places. So they invade Illyria, they invade Cisalpine Gaul, they start taking small bits of Spain, southern France, kind of stuff like that. They're expanding their influence politically with a lot of trading deals and things like that. And then the Second Punic War, take the whole of Spain, and suddenly they've essentially doubled the land size of their territory.
Oh, easily, easily.
And then if you include the adding on of the client kingdom of Numidia following the Second Punic War, they really have over doubled the size of their territory.
But what it's also done is, by them getting all this new territory, it means they've got new neighbours, new people bordering on them. So, for instance, by having new areas in Spain that they didn't have previously, now the new kingdoms next to them are starting to get an idea of Rome. They could be easier to transition with. They can put their influence on them. But there is also the flip side where they could become hostile. So they could start to resent the idea of Rome because it's a massive threat. There's a huge empire, which I would actually argue now it's an empire, is next to them. So they might start conflicts. But what this does, it means Rome is then shoved into wars because there are hostile neighbours on them. But when they defeat them, perhaps it's easier to transition that because they're more used to Roman influence then.
Yeah, I think that argument could be made. And I think one important point that you brought up as well is the idea that as a result of the First and Second Punic Wars, you can officially describe Rome as an empire, I think, because a lot of people will say you separate Roman history into the Republican and the Imperial period, right? And in the Imperial period, they are the Roman Empire.
Yes.
But I think it should be said that the Roman Republic is an empire. An empire doesn't have to have an emperor.
No, it just needs a state, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Which would be the Senate.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I think that idea of just the propulsion of Roman expansion to so quickly take all of Spain. I mean, it takes the Carthaginians, the better part of like 20 years to take all of their Spanish territories, and then
Yeah.
the Romans just get it from them in one fell swoop.
Yeah.
In about like 5 or 6 years is Scipio's campaign in Spain. So
Yeah, it was very quick and very devastating. And I think it's also really important, actually, just to highlight how lucky we are to have Hannibal and Scipio Africanus, two great generals in the same war, because a lot of people talk like, oh, who's better, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar? But this is like one of the few times we actually have two amazing generals in the same battle fighting each other. You know, it's really rare. I just think that I love that about the Punic Wars. You know, you get the best of every bit.
Yeah, the Second Punic War is definitely one of the more fun wars to study.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess to conclude then, we've sort of agreed that Rome definitely did become an empire because of the Punic Wars, and this is the point where Rome now becomes the foundations of what we know and love Rome to be. And it's also clear that with the end of the Second Punic War, Rome had now become the definite superpower in the Western Mediterranean, and at this point is probably now also the biggest superpower in the Mediterranean. The Seleucid Empire and the Egyptian Empire are still large, but they would definitely be a challenge for them to defeat Rome at this point. So I think it's clear that Rome had now become what we know and love. Rome is now the empire that's going to take over most of the known world. Thank you very much for tuning into this episode of the AIQ Podcast. Thank you very much to Cristopher Kearney for coming on and being our special guest.
Thanks for having me. It's been good fun.
Yeah.
I like talking. So.
Yeah, maybe we can get you back in the future, do a different subject. Maybe you like a bit more. But so we're just going to read off a couple of books now. Chris is going to suggest one book that he would recommend you read if you want to read about this subject, and I'm going to recommend one as well. So what's your book?
Yeah, so I'm big on the ancient sources. So honestly, I would recommend just reading Polybius' account of especially the First and Second Punic Wars. The First Punic War is book 1 of Polybius' Histories, and the Second Punic War is book 3 of Polybius' Histories. I think starting at the ancient sources is generally a good place to go, and then being able to engage with the ancient sources really helps develop an understanding of events and things like that.
See, and I'm quite big on the modern side. I like reading the ancient text, but I really like to get a modern conception of it, because there are a lot of problems with ancient texts, I find. You know, there is this historical bias that is very hard to see and underline why it's there and where it is and when it goes away and what's true and not. So I really like to get a modern idea with people who put modern theories onto the ancient text. So I would really recommend The Fall of Carthage, the Punic Wars, and that's done by a gentleman called Adrian Goldsworthy. Thank you again for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.